unrequited love, an eventual discussion of my vagina as metaphor. And that's what I can write, which doesn't happen to be true anymore. Right now, I am a pathetic and confused young woman of 26, a writer who can't write. I'm up late asking you a question, really questioning myself. I've sat here at my desk for hours, mentally immobile. I look up people I used to love, like Fuck Taco, and wonder why they never loved me. I lie face down on my bed and feel scared. I get up, go to the computer, feel worse. David Foster Wallace called himself a failed writer at 28. Several months ago, when depression hooked its teeth into me, I complained to my then-boyfriend about how I'll never be as good as Wallace. He screamed at me on Guerrero Street in San Francisco. Stop it. He killed himself, Elissa. I hope to God you're never like him. I understand women like me are hurting and dealing with self-trivialization, contempt for other, more successful people, misplaced compassion, addiction, and depression, whether they're writers or not. Think of the canon of women writers. A unifying theme is that so many of their careers ended in suicide. I often explain to my mother that to be a writer /a woman writer means to suffer mercilessly and eventually collapse in a heap of, I could have been better than this. She pleads with me, can't it be different? Can it? I want to jump out of a window for what I boil down to is one reason. I can't write a book. But it's not that I want to die so much as have an entirely different life. I start to think I should choose another profession. As Lori Moore suggests, movie star / astronaut, a movie star / missionary, a movie star / kindergarten teacher. I want to throw off everything I've accumulated and begin as someone new, someone better. I don't have a bad life. I didn't have a painful childhood. I know I'm not the first depressed writer, because the latter is less accurate, the former is more acute. I've been clinically diagnosed with major depressive disorder and have an off and on relationship with prescription medication, which I confide so it doesn't seem I throw around the term depression. That said, I'm high functioning, a high functioning head case, one who jokes enough that most people don't know the truth. The truth. I am sick with panic that I cannot, will not, override my limitations, insecurities, jealousies, and ineptitude to write well, with intelligence and heart and lengthiness. And I fear that, even if I do manage to write, that the stories I write about my vagina, etc., will be disregarded and mocked. How do I reach the page when I can't lift my face off the bed? How does one go on, sugar, when you realize you might not have it in you? How does a woman get up and become the writer she wishes she'd be? Sincerely, Elissa Bassist.
Thank you. That's one. I should explain. I hadn't ever met Elissa when she wrote this letter. We met after this, and she's the only letter writer whose real name has ever been used in the column, and I had real trepidation about that. But the deal that we made is that I told her she didn't get to read the letter until it was published on Olympus, and that I wasn't going to treat her any differently than I would somebody who'd written to me anonymously, which I think was really brave of Elissa to do. So here's what I said. It's so cool to get to read it to her. We should be in bed, snuggled up. Right now my kids are snuggled up in bed. It'll be like your bedtime, Rainey. Dear Elissa Bassist, when I was 28, I had a chalkboard in my living room. It was one of those two-sided wooden A-frames that stand on their own and fold flat. On one side of the chalkboard I wrote, "The first product of self-knowledge is humility, Flannery O'Connor." And on the other side I wrote, "She sat and thought of only one thing, of her mother holding onto their hands, Eudora Welty." The quote by Eudora Welty is from her novel The Optimist's Daughter, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1972. It was a book I read again and again. And that line about the woman who sat thinking of only one thing was at the heart of the reason why I sat like that too, thinking of only one thing. One thing that was actually two things pressed together, like the back-to-back quotes on my chalkboard. How much I missed my mother, and how the only way I could bear to live without her was to write a book. My book. The one that I'd known was in me since way before I knew people like me could have books inside of them. The one I felt pulsing, like in my chest, like a second heart, formless and unimaginable, until my mother died, and there it was. The plot revealed, the story I couldn't live without telling. That I hadn't written a book by the time I was 28 was a sad shock to me. Of myself, I'd expected greater things. I was a bit like you, Elissa Bassist, without a book, but not entirely without literary acclaim. I won a few grants and awards, published a couple of stories and essays. These minor successes stoked the grandiose ideas I had about what I would achieve and by what age. I read voraciously. I practically memorized the work of writers I loved. I recorded my life copiously and artfully in my journals. I wrote stories in feverish, intermittent bursts, believing they'd miraculously form a novel without my having to suffer too much over it. But I was wrong. The second heart inside me beat ever stronger, but nothing miraculously became a book. As my 30th birthday approached, I realized that if I truly wanted to write the story I had to tell, I would have to gather everything within me to make it happen. I would have to sit and think of only one thing, longer and harder than I thought possible. I would have to suffer, by which I mean work. At the time, I believed that I'd wasted my 20s by not having come out of them with a finished book, and I bitterly lambasted myself for that. I thought a lot of the same things about myself that you do, Elissa Bassist, that I was lazy and lame, that even though I had the story in me, I didn't have it in me to see it to fruition, to actually get it out of my body and onto the page, to write, as you say, with intelligence and heart and lengthiness. But I finally reached a point where the prospect of not writing a book was more awful than the one of writing a book that sucked. And so at last I got to work on the book. When I was done writing it, I understood that things happened just as they were meant to, that I couldn't have written my book before I did. I simply was not capable of doing so, either as a writer or a person. To get to the point I had to get to write my first book, I had to do everything I did in my 20s. I had to write a lot of sentences that never turned into anything, and stories that never miraculously formed a novel. I had to read voraciously and compose exhaustive entries in my journals. I had to waste time and grieve my mother and come to terms with my childhood and have stupid and sweet and scandalous sexual relationships and grow up. In short, I had to gain the self-knowledge that Flannery O'Connor mentions in that quote I wrote on my chalkboard. And once I got there, I had to make a hard stop at self-knowledge's first product, humility. Do you know what that is, sweet pea? To be humble. The word comes from the Latin words humus and humus, to be down low, to be of the earth, to be on the ground. That's where I went when I wrote the last word of my first book, straight onto the cool tile floor to weep. I sobbed and I wailed and I laughed through my tears. I didn't get up for a half an hour. I was too happy and grateful to stand. I'd turned 35 a few weeks before. I was 2 months pregnant with my first child. I didn't know if people would think my book was good or bad or horrible or beautiful, and I didn't care. I only knew I no longer had two hearts beating in my chest. I pulled out one with my own bare hands. I'd suffered. I'd given it everything I had.
I'd finally been able to give it because I'd let go of all the grandiose ideas I'd once had about myself and my writing. So young, so talented. I'd stopped being grandiose. I lowered myself to the notion that the absolute only thing that mattered was getting that extra beating heart out of my chest, which meant I had to write my book, my very possibly mediocre book, my very possibly never going to be published book. My absolutely nowhere in the league with the writers I admired so much that I practically memorized their sentences book. It was only then when I humbly surrendered that I was able to do the work I needed to do. I hope you'll think hard about that, honey bun. If you had a two-sided chalkboard in your living room, I'd write humility on one side and surrender on the other. That's what I think you need to find to do to get yourself out of the funk you're in. The most fascinating thing to me about your letter is that buried beneath all the anxiety and sorrow and fear and self-loathing, there's arrogance at its core. It presumes you should be successful at 26, when really it takes most writers much longer to get there. It laments that you'll never be as good as David Foster Wallace, a genius, master of the craft, while at the same time describing how little you write. You loathe yourself, and yet you're consumed by the grandiose ideas you have about your own importance. You're up too high and down too low. Neither is the place where we get the work done. We get the work done on the ground level, and the kindest thing I can do for you is to tell you to get your ass on the floor. I know. There you go. I know it's hard to write, darling, but it's harder not to. The only way you'll find out if you have it in you is to get to work and see if you do. The only way to override your limitations, insecurities, jealousies, and ineptitude is to produce. You have limitations. You are, in some ways, inept. This is true of every writer, and it's especially true of writers who are 26. You will feel insecure and jealous. How much power you give those feelings is entirely up to you. That you struggle with major depressive disorder certainly adds a layer to your anxieties or to your difficulties. I've not focused on it in my answer because I believe, and it seems you believe, that it's only a layer. It goes without saying that your life is more important than your writing, and that you should consult your doctor about how your depression may contribute to the despair you're feeling about your work. I'm not a doctor, so I can't advise you about that, but I can tell you that you're not alone in your insecurities and fears. They're typical of writers, even those who don't have depression. Artists of all sorts